So I'm going to sit down here, nice and comfortable, and if my voice just starts going on and on and on, and it's a warm evening and my voice is going on and on and on, you can just look up there and look at the images, and my voice will just disappear into the background. I've long been interested in sacred or imaginal ways of understanding the body, and in particular the possible transformations of the body way back in the midst of time. So this is kind of late 1980s, early 1990s. My PhD was entitled De Quincey's Troubled Body. The English writer Thomas De Quincey, that's supposed to be a caricature of Thomas De Quincey up there. The English writer Thomas De Quincey, such as my argument anyway, believed that the creative imagination of the true genius had as its foundation an ideal physical and physiological order which was spiritual as much as material. Unfortunately, his own imagination was at the mercy of a wayward, dyspeptic, and very much less than spiritualized body. Hence, if anyone has heard of him at all, it's as a notorious and chronic opium eater. The opium eater, in fact. His most famous work is called Confessions of an English Opium Eater. That is not Thomas De Quincey. Later in the 90s, so we're talking, I suppose it must have been about 97, 98 by now, while battling with my own dyspeptic system, I came across a very strange book indeed called God's Gym. It was written by a theologian, an English theologian, I think he's English, called Stephen Moore. It's a strange work, eccentric theology, which looked at the divine bodies, and how they might be achieved. Stephen Moore argued, that the Bible portrays the bodies of God the Father and God the Son as massive and massively muscular. They're crazily overinflated, hyper-masculinized bodies of bodybuilders, eternally kicking sand into the face of pencil-necked rivals. Well beyond the limits of merely natural corporality, these divine bodies are nothing more than special effects in the end, designed to strike fear, the fear of God, into human and indeed divine weaklings, those less than God. The implication of Moore's work is that if we imitate Christ, then we too can have the ripped and huge body of God. We can have a divine body. Now, I was intrigued, but I must say less than entranced by these God bodies, which Moore describes in prose which drips with sarcasm and irony, like a body dripping sweat while pumping iron. If I wanted to understand divine bodies, whatever they may be, and how they may be achieved, I really didn't find the answers between the perspiring pages of this book. My interest in such matters waned, but never completely died, I must say. And about 9-10 years ago or so, I started coming across references to deified, to divinized bodies in what, for me, was a rather unexpected quarter. It was in the theology of the Eastern Orthodox Church. And as I discovered over the subsequent years, this long and mystical tradition is rich in meditations on divine bodies and how we too can have one. Bodies which are, if not infinite, at least almost infinite, and certainly eternal, with senses which far surpass Superman's super senses. That's a very fine image, I'm guessing, from a kind of early 1940s Superman comic, maybe late 1930s. I don't know. That's one of my other interests, is comics. I started finding references in this mystical theology to how we can achieve more than X-ray vision and more than hyper-hearing whose reach has no evident end. How we may achieve bodies which are perhaps neither masculine nor feminine, but which enjoy a dynamic and ever-changing and ever-shifting union with God, in which ecstasy leads to ecstasy forever. These are loving and subtle bodies which literally outshine Stephen Moore's hard, almost robotic bodies of shock and awe, and render them transparent and fragile as paper. There we have Stephen Moore's bodybuilders falling to the ground at the bottom in the face of a true transfigured body. The spiritual life of the Eastern Orthodox Church, I found out, is an ancient living wellspring of transforming and transfiguring teaching and practices, which was almost completely forgotten, I think, in Western Europe until well into the 20th century. Even now, when educated people talk about the history of the Church in Europe, they almost exclusively mean the Roman Catholic Church, thus unwittingly, perhaps, perpetuating the suppression of all knowledge of orthodoxy, Eastern Orthodoxy that is, and perhaps ironically, tacitly accepting the Catholic Church's own version of Christian history and doctrine. This is the Church in the West I'm talking about. Eastern Orthodoxy, however, has preserved teachings which are holistic and which are radical. Above all, Eastern Orthodox theology is a reminder, a recollection, and a performance of deification, or theosis. Deification underpins its whole understanding of the divine economy, the workings of the divine in the world. As St. Irenaeus of Lyon, a Greek from Smyrna, wrote in the 2nd century, Christ, and I'm quoting St. Irenaeus now, Christ became what we are in order to make us what he is himself. And Irenaeus' words were pithily paraphrased in the early 4th century by St. Athanasius of Alexandria, who wrote, "He became human that we might become divine. He became human that we might become divine." God then became human that we humans might become gods. It's a simple yet infinitely complex statement, and it's at the absolute core of the Orthodox worldview. And one important, perhaps, well, certainly unexpected implication of deification is that theologians properly understood are gods. For the Orthodox Church, the Eastern Orthodox Church, theology, theologia, refers not to kind of speculation or learned discourse on God, but to the contemplation of God himself. And I'm taking that quotation of God, the contemplation of God himself from a theologian. It's a very different understanding of theology from that cultivated in Western Europe, especially perhaps in the last 200 years or so. Rather than being dry as dust, this is theology as gnosis, It's knowledge based on actual experience rather than, shall we say, theoretical speculation, and has at its core nothing less than the fate of the whole human being. The theologian's contemplation of God transforms them until they are gods themselves. The ultimate aim of theology, in the words of Vladimir Lossky, and Vladimir Lossky is one of the greats of 20th century theology, Orthodox theology. The ultimate aim of theology is union with God or deification. That's what Lossky says. It goes without saying, and I think it's probably immediately apparent that I am not a theologian. Many people are. I don't mean to say that theology or theosis, I don't mean to say that theosis is only available to a select few, the elite as it were. It's not. It's not at all. It's a divine gift to us all. Whereas for Aristotle, a human is a politikon zoon, for Gregory of Nazianzus, who's a 4th century saint, who was the Archbishop of Constantinople. For Gregory of Nazianzus, a human is a zoon theoumenon, which means an animal that is being deified, or an animal that is becoming a god. What is certain, however, is that only very few of us human animals have the real inclination and application to accept the gift of deification. Otherwise, you'd see more of them walking around, more theologians on the streets, be able to point them out. The doctrine of divination is based on a reading of several passages from the Bible. In Psalm 82, for example, the psalmist writes, "I have said, ye are gods, and all of you are children of the Most High." Christ himself refers to this psalm in the Gospel of St. John, who significantly is known as John the Theologian in the Orthodox Church. So, the Gospel of John the Theologian, accused by the Jews of blasphemy for saying that he and the Father are one, Jesus reminds them that they too are gods and children of God, saying, "Is it not written in your law, I said ye are gods?" Christ is implying that his accusers are gods, contemplating, surrounding God. Of equal significance for the doctrine of theosis is a passage from Peter's second epistle in which he refers to the gifts of God, I'm quoting here, "whereby are given unto us exceeding great and precious promises, that by these ye might be partakers of the divine nature." Deification also draws on manifold extra Christian sources from outside Christianity. Among the most important, I think, of these are Roman ideas of the emperor as God. Platonism, particularly, I've read, I'm no great expert on this, particularly the theurgy of Iamblichus, Jewish, mystical and apocalyptic thinking. The terminology and metaphors of theosis, however, are largely Christian. If they sound strange and un-Christian to Western European ears, that just goes to show how much has been forgotten of this tradition, still living tradition. I must say, however, it's not my intention to give a kind of history of ideas overview, this leads to this and this leads to that, and now we can see this, etc., of deification. And if you want one, you can find extremely, well, I think, efficient and full, comprehensive overview in a book by Norman Russell called The Doctrine of Deification in the Greek Patristic Tradition. What really interests me, however, is the way it's worked out, the idea the experience, the way it's really worked out, somatically, so bodily, psychically, pneumatically, in the soul and in the spirit, how it's experienced and worked out over the centuries in this particular context of the Eastern Orthodox Church. Just one more kind of prefatory, remark as a preface. Deification itself has been understood in a variety of different ways from the time of the very early Christianity. Norman Russell, who I just mentioned, summarises very useful some of the contrasting understandings of deification in an ascending order, so from the most basic to the most sublime. We have what he calls the application of the word gods to human beings simply as a title of honour. Secondly, the use of the word God analogically. Moses is a god to Pharaoh, as a wise man is a god to a fool. And the next one, attainment of likeness to God through ascetic and philosophical endeavour. And finally, the highest meaning, if you like, and the meaning which certainly interests me the most, and which I'm going to try to explore here, the actual transformation into a God by contemplation and union with God. Transfiguration, you might say, into a being which is, in some respects, no longer merely human and may not be recognisable by other humans. In the words of the great Romanian theologian Dumitru Staniloae, deification, and these are his words, continues beyond the ultimate limits of the powers of human nature to the infinite. And Staniloae goes on, deification, in a strict sense, involves the progress which man makes beyond the boundaries of his nature to the divine and supernatural level, here and now, not in some possible future state, not in some life to come, but in this life. For being a god, being suprahuman, if you like, can be experienced, as I said, in this life, but if only by a few, in its highest form. And as I said, they may not even be recognisable anymore to those with merely human senses. So, if you see a theologian walking down the street, you probably won't see a theologian walking down the street. He will not appear to your merely human senses. If you have merely human senses, I don't know what your senses are like. Mine are certainly merely human. Even lower than that sometimes. Oh my God, I need so much help sensing things. This ontological transformation, this metamorphosis into the stuff of Christ, is holistic. It entails the divinization of the complete person of the believer, including, as I said, the body. So in most Christian traditions, the body is, or should perhaps, be seen as an essential and ineradicable part of the whole human, and not as something to be discarded, as something which is alien to our being. So in the 2nd century, Tatian, for example, wrote of the transformation of the whole person, body, soul and spirit. Around the same time, not much later, Clement of Alexandria described how a Christian becomes, this is Clement of Alexandria, becomes a god while still moving about in the flesh. While in the 7th century, the Greek father St. Maximus the Confessor said, the body is deified at the same time as the soul. John the theologian, in the first letter, the first epistle, says God is light. And so too is a God, a deified person. This deified body was understood, experienced and seen to shine with light, which at its brightest was blindingly white as the body and raiment of Christ on Mount Tabor, when Matthew writes, his face did shine as the sun and his raiment was white as the light. According to the homilies of St. Macarius, probably, written in Syria towards the end of the 4th century. This is St. Macarius. Just as the Lord's body was glorified when he went up the mountain and was transfigured into the glory of God and into infinite light, so the saints' bodies also are gloried and shine as lightning. Our human nature, he goes on, our human nature is transformed into the power of God and is kindled into fire and light. It must be noted that this transformation is not metaphorical or symbolic. It actually happened. It was actually seen. The deified body of lightning was witnessed. The story is told of someone called Abba Joseph of Panepho, a man of great renown on the desert farms. He was approached, apparently, the story goes, by a fellow monk. And this monk asked him, "Father, according to my strength, I keep a modest rule of prayer, fasting, meditation, and quiet. And according to my strength, I purge my imagination. What more must I do?" The story goes on. The old man, rising, held up his hands against the sky, and his fingers became like 10 torches of fire, and he said, "If thou wilt, thou shalt be made wholly aflame." And put his fingers out. Abba Joseph does not reveal the effulgence of his whole body, contenting himself with limiting the demonstration to his fine fingers, perhaps because to do more would be to overwhelm and even imperil the senses of the poor monk who questioned him. In the 19th century, St. Seraphim of South shone so brightly that some felt they would be blinded if they looked at him. Nicholas Motovilov. I apologise to all of the people's names who I massacre with my pronunciation. So sorry, Nicholas. Nicholas Motovilov wrote a first-hand account. And this is a rather long... That wasn't actually meant to be a pun on hands, but he wrote a first-hand account. It's quite long, but I'd like to read it. But how? I asked Father Seraphim. How can I know that I am in the grace of the Holy Spirit? I need to understand completely. Father Seraphim then took me, Nicholas Motovilov is telling the story, then took me very firmly by the shoulders and said, "We are both, you and I, in the Spirit of God this moment, my son. Why do you not look at me?" "I cannot look, Father," I replied, "because great flashes of lightning are springing from your eyes. Your face shines with more light than the sun, and my eyes ache from pain." "Don't be frightened, friend of God," Father Seraphim said. "You yourself have now become as bright as I am, and you are now yourself in the fullness of the Spirit of God. Otherwise you would not be able to see me like this. Why don't you look at me, my son? Just look. Don't be afraid. The Lord is with us." At these words I looked into his face and was seized with an even greater sense of trembling awe. Imagine, in the centre of the sun, in the most dazzling brilliance of his noontime rays, the face of a man talking to you. You see the movement of his lips, the changing expression of his eyes, you hear his voice. You feel that someone is holding his hands on your shoulders, yet you do not see his hands or his body, but only a blinding light spreading around for several yards, illuminating with its brilliant sheen both the bank of snow covering the glade and the snowflakes that fall on me and the great starets. The great starets is St. Seraphim, starets being elder, the elder. Motovilov is able to bear what, for me, would be unbearable, because he is himself momentarily raised to the deified state that St. Seraphim enjoys permanently. And such experiences are not confined to safely distanced times and places, the times of the desert fathers or strange people in 19th century Russia. On his deathbed in Paris in 1944, Sergei Bulgakov, who was another great theologian, he's mainly known for his writings on Sophia. Sergei Bulgakov's face was seen to metamorphose into a mass of light. Those who would nevertheless dismiss such events as at its best amplification or pious fraud and at worst hallucinations are asked to heed the word of a light-filled theologian, St. Simeon the New Theologian, who lived from 949 to 1022. And St. Simeon the New Theologian wrote, "We do not speak of things of which we are ignorant, but we bear witness to that which we know. For the light already shines in the darkness, in the light and in the day, in our hearts and minds. This light, without change, without decline, and never extinguished, enlightens us. It speaks, it acts, it lives, it gives life. It transforms into light those whom it illumines. Those who have not achieved this light," he goes on, "have not yet received grace. Those who have not yet received, who have not yet participated in this light, find themselves always under the yoke of the law, in the region of shadows and fantasies." So to be a theologian, it's just exploring this idea, this thing which is apparently seen and indeed experienced. To be a theologian is to have one's whole body shine with a light potentially brighter than any lightning, more blinding than any sun. It is to be a theologian, is to be a theophany, a living icon of God, raised out of time and the limits of matter. And this shining, brilliant, lightning deified body has super senses. In the 3rd century, Origen described these senses like this. What do you think they will do when the word of God takes over their hearing and sight and touch and taste? And when he gives to each of their senses the powers of which they are naturally capable, there are the more divine senses, which Solomon calls divine, and which Jeremiah says are the senses of the heart. Christ himself refers to these super senses in Matthew. I owe this reference to Geoffrey, so thank you very much. You quoted this, you recognised this. I wasn't aware of it before. So Christ, addressing his disciples, contrasts their senses, their super senses, to the merely material and muddy senses of the multitude he's been addressing. He says, "This people's heart is waxed gross, and their ears are dull of hearing, and their eyes are closed, lest at any time they should see with their eyes, hear with their ears, and should understand with their heart, and should be converted, and I should heal them. But blessed are your eyes, that they see, and your ears, that they hear." He's speaking metaphorically. God is speaking metaphorically, but at the same time, he's speaking literally. The healing that he offers has transformed and will continue to transform the bodies and senses of his disciples utterly, so that those around him actually see and hear things unavailable to most people. And significantly, at the centre of this transfigured person is not the brain, but the heart. Understand with their heart, says Christ. Not the brain, but the heart, which understands in a wholly other way to the brain mind. I'll return to this idea later. But just to reiterate, in case it hasn't become absolutely apparent by now, I'm not a theologian. Any superpowers I may have are the merely mundane ones granted by the accidents of chronology. Using these non-superpowers, I'm going to make a mighty leap forwards now, 1300 years or so from the time of Christ, to Gregory Palamas, to St. Gregory Palamas's In Defence of the Holy Hesychasts, also known as the Triads. So it consists of 3 parts, and each of those 3 parts is divided into 3. I hope I'm not wrong on this. I don't know. I may be. I take it anyway to be the greatest guide to becoming transfigured, to becoming a shining and deified body and soul and spirit. And I think certainly it's the most outstanding example of Byzantine theology, theology in the highest sense of the word. With the help of Gregory Palamas and his work in defence of the Holy Hesychasts, I'd like to further elucidate, to shine light on, or have light shone on me, this infinite body of eternal light. Gregory was born in about 1296, in Constantinople. From an early age, he seems to have been attracted to the monastic life. He became eventually a monk and then a hermit on Mount Athos, the great Orthodox holy mountain. What he no doubt hoped would be a life of seclusion and devotion was disrupted over the next decades by Turkish raids, theological controversies and civil war, all of which Gregory found himself caught up in. Towards the end of his life, he was taken prisoner by Turkish pirates who demanded that they be paid a ransom for him. During his captivity, he engaged the members of the Sultan's family in conversation regarding the tenets of Islam, and is reported to have expressed his hope of understanding between Christians and Muslims. He died in Thessalonica, where he was bishop in 1359. His great work in defence of the Holy Hesychasts is written between 1338 and 1341. It describes the spiritual practices which, when accompanied by grace, I'm quoting Gregory Palamas, transform the body into something better and deify it, and grant to the body also the experience of things divine, and allow it the same blessed experiences as the soul undergoes. Palamas rejects the idea that the body is somehow evil, inherently evil. He rejects the idea that it's something to be discarded or transcended on the spiritual path. He says the body is not evil in itself. It is true that the mind, or the nous, the highest part of the soul capable of knowing God, has become fixated on the fleshly passions. But the solution is not for the mind to leave or to reject the body. He writes, "A man will be excluded from the kingdom of God if he devotes his energies to making his mind go out from within himself. We must indeed seek to do the exact opposite. We must, and I'm quoting Gregory Palamas again, we must force the mind to return within the body. And where must it then be made to reside? Not in the brain, he writes, but what is understood to be in orthodoxy the corporeal, psychic and spiritual centre of a human being, in the heart. He writes, we must gather together the mind and enclose it in the body, and especially in that body most interior to the body, which we call the heart. This may happen through prayer, through certain breathing techniques, through the adoption of the appropriate postures, in a word, through hesychastic practices. Hesychasm comes from the word hesychia, which means tranquility, quiet. People who practice hesychastic practices, they do so through prayer, so primarily the short Jesus prayer, or Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner. There are different versions of that, but that's the kind of standard version, which is, first of all, there are many different explanations of how to go about this. But perhaps we can imagine, first of all, it's in beginners have to start somewhere, so we say it aloud, that prayer. Then once we have found that we're no longer being distracted, we say it in our mind, in our brain, this thing up here, again and again and again. And at some mysterious moment, the words apparently no longer go on up here. They descend with the mind itself into the heart. And the words are then said, not up here, but here, over and over again. And then, in the final, I suppose, the highest point, I don't know, of hesychasm, it becomes the prayer of the heart, where the words themselves stop, and there's no words at all. There's just the beating of the heart, and the beating of the heart becomes the prayer. The words have stopped, the prayer has turned into the body, the whole body has become prayer, the heart has become prayer, and from the heart, the whole body becomes prayer. This prayer is, it may be associated or accompanied by various postures, various ways of sitting, etc., but not necessarily. One of the most important things, I think, is that it's recommended that if one really wants to follow this prayer, you need a guide, a wise guide, someone to take you through it. Otherwise, as in many spiritual traditions, there's the danger of mental and physical unbalance and ill health. Anyway, when the mind has descended into the heart and it's no longer distracted, it then becomes deified through union with Christ, with God. And then deification, as it were, radiates out from the body's body, the secret chamber of the body, the heart. It then radiates out to transform the whole fleshly nature of the person. And he writes, this is Gregory Palamas again, their flesh also is transformed and elevated, participating together with the soul in the divine communion, and becoming itself a dwelling and possession of God. The body becomes what it should be and what it essentially is a manifestation or a mode of spirit. I would say, I don't know how orthodox this is, but I'd say that behind Gregory Palamas's thinking is the idea that the material body, the body as just matter, is a creation of the mind. It's what the mind has come to focus on. As it becomes focused or fixated on the body's feelings, on the body's drives, the mind gives the body a kind of material solidity which it does not essentially possess. The body ceases at that moment to be spirit and body at the same time, a mode of spirit. It's hard to talk about these things. And it starts to block out, as it were, the presence of the divine. It starts to block out its own awareness of its own divinity. It says that matter as matter did not actually exist. That means matter as something separate from or opposed to spirit rather than as a mode of spirit. It did not actually exist until we ceased to see God, see that God is all in all, and instead focused our attention solely on the outward appearances of the material world. This is one meaning of the fall. Callistos Ware, who's still around, writes, "Matter as we know it in this fallen world, with all its inertness and opacity, does not at all correspond to matter as God intended it to be." The fall, in the view of the Eastern Church, is the result of our mind shifting attention, as it were, and consequently transforming the body and all the world into a kind of carapace, a hard shell, massive musculature of a bodybuilder worn like an exoskeleton, blocking out true nature from our awareness, so that in the words of another 20th century Orthodox writer, it now seems natural for man to experience the world as opaque and not shot through with the presence of God. The dense presence of opaque matter reflects back to the mind the misperception which began in the mind itself, seemingly confirming the truth of that misperception. The mind, in a way, creates a material world and matter as apparently utterly separate from spirit, and then only sees around it this material world, so confirming the truth of its misperception. Deification, beginning in the heart, radiating through the whole of the body, and then through the whole of creation, reverses this fallen condition, raises the spiritual body here and now, engendering a body which remains a body, doesn't disappear, it's not left behind, is still perceptible by the senses, only is not defined by matter. It's not opaque, but brightly shining with the divine presence. A body which no longer encloses the heart, but is the heart. A body which is all heart. This transformed heart-body, body-heart, heart-body, also possesses transformed senses. Gregory Palamas, referring to the Transfiguration, makes the really very traditional point, it's traditional in the Eastern Church, maybe in the Western, I don't know, makes the traditional point that it was at the Transfiguration on Mount Tabor, it was not Christ who was changed at that moment, but the senses of the disciples, who at that moment were able to actually see for the first time the true shining body of their Lord. The light of Christ, Palamas writes, I'm quoting him here, became accessible to their eyes, but to eyes which saw in a way superior to that of natural sight, and had acquired the spiritual power of the spiritual light. He also quotes, Palamas also quotes the 4th century saint Basil the Great, who wrote, he refers to the power which enlightens those who have purified the eyes of the heart. The transfiguration, then, properly understood, is not the transfiguration of Christ, it's the transfiguration of the bodies and senses of the 3 disciples. They become gods to see God with the eyes of gods, which are the eyes of the heart, and see through and beyond matter in a way in which a muscle-bound superhero can only ever dream of. And this deified heart body, which sees with the eyes of the heart, perceives a whole world transfigured, a world in which matter is spirit and spirit is matter, and there's no duality pitting one against the other. Callistus Ware, again, borrowing a phrase from Blake, writes that the deified body sees with double vision. We perceive, he writes, we perceive each kingfisher, each frog, each human face, each blade of grass in its uniqueness. But also we see the world transparent to and shining with the divine presence. And this happens simultaneously. Callistus Ware writes, the more a thing becomes transparent, the more it is seen as uniquely itself. This shining world reminds me, and it may remind others, especially people who are taking and have taken the MA with Cosmology and the Sacred here. It reminds me of the Mundus Imaginalis, the realm of Sufi mysticism described by Henri Corbin. Corbin tells us that it's an intermediary world, spirit and matter, seen by the heart when its eye of imagination is open, when the eye of the heart is opened. For Orthodox theologians, this realm, this mundus imaginalis, is quite precisely this world, when seen correctly. And we are what Corbin would call imaginal beings. Of course, the deified body, unrestrained by dense, dead, dull matter, enjoys not just supersight, all of its supernatural senses. That's a phrase from Gregory Palamas. All of its supernatural senses perceive materially and spiritually at the same time. The mango is deliciously ripe with essential mango-ness, and its savour reaches all the way to God. Gregory, that was me talking about mangoes, not less. So you probably saw me licking my lips. Gregory is careful to point out that it is only through these senses that the truth of things is achieved, perceived. Some people, he says, and I'm quoting him again, some people may study the size or movement of the heavens and the celestial bodies and the effects these bring about. They may concern themselves, he writes, with the earth and what is around it, and the metals and the precious stones in its interior. Oh, that's Henri Corbin, who I was talking about before, talking to Jung, looking a bit perplexed. So that's the interior of the earth, metals and precious stones in the earth's interior. But people may do that, but if they do not, Palamas writes, if they do not primarily pray and love God, if they rely solely, as it were, on the merely natural senses, they will be blinded by hard surfaces. It's not that studying the world revealed by the natural senses is a bad thing, but it does become so if it's the sole focus of endeavour, or if it takes up too much of our attention. then it serves to thicken the opaque shell of matter separating us from God. So for Palamas, you will understand the whole of medical science is essentially immoral. Trapping us in a kind of counterfeit world, the work of the devil. At the same time, perceiving with deified senses means to know that one does not. It means to know that one does not actually see God. Some of you may know that I like paradoxes, and you may have heard me indeed quoting some of the paradoxes that I'm about to quote, quoting some of the things I'm about to quote. But we have to resort to paradoxes. The theologian sees the divine presence and doesn't see it at the very same time. When the theologian looks at the world, you'll understand when I say theologian, theologian is a great saint, someone who's been transfigured. When the theologian looks at the world, he exclaims with the novelist and poet Charles Williams, who's one of the Inklings, who's a mate of Tolkien and Lewis and Barfield. When the theologian looks at the world, he exclaims with the novelist and poet Charles Williams, "This also is thou. Neither is this thou." That is, he sees God present in everything, and also sees that God is always transcendent. He's absolutely God, is absolutely here in the world, and always absolutely elsewhere. Dionysius the Areopagite wrote in the 5th, possibly the 6th century, God is all things in all things and nothing in any. So seeing with a double vision means seeing and unseeing at the same time. And it also means neither of those things. As Gregory Palamas writes, God is not only beyond knowledge, but also beyond unknowing. God is not only beyond knowledge, but also beyond unknowing. That is, the deified body sees and knows God in a way which is beyond seeing and unseeing, beyond knowing and unknowing. And it does this, and this is the important thing, it does this through direct participation or union with God. It's able to do so, of course, because it's a body of light. The deified body is a body of light. That's light, and I'm quoting Palamas again, that light which is the splendour of the deified flesh, letting all masks fall, stepping out from endless labyrinths of deception in which unreality leads forever to unreality. Deified beings of light mingle in a complex and almost erotic intertwining with the light of God, which is the light of this world. And there's a nice quotation here. I'm just going to need some water to prepare myself. It's one of my favourite quotations, and I'll try to do it justice. It is in light that the light is seen, and that which sees operates in a similar light. Having separated itself from all other beings, it becomes itself all light, and is assimilated to what it sees, or rather, it is united to it without mingling, being itself light, and seeing light through light. If it sees itself, it sees light. If it beholds the object of its vision, that too is light. And if it looks at the means by which it sees, again it is light. End of quotation. Light is within light. Gods are within God, and God is within gods. in the process of deification. It's a process of deification which is dynamic, never ending. It's another quotation from Palamas. Always he's being borne on to further progress and experiencing even more resplendent contemplation. He understands then that his vision is infinite, because it is a vision of the infinite, and because he does not see the limit of that brilliance. But all the more, he sees how feeble is his capacity to receive the light. So what that means is that these special super deified senses simultaneously perceive infinity and their own capacity to perceive, their own incapacity to perceive infinity. They perceive infinity and their own incapacity to perceive infinity. They see the light which goes on forever, and they know that there will always be more to see. They're drawn on by their desire for God, and their endless progress means that they perceive ever more infinitely, if it's possible to say that, and at the same time perceive ever more acutely their limitations. That's light, uncreated light. That's Blake. So deified bodies are infinite and finite at the same time. Super sensors see forever and see that they will never see forever. God is known and absolutely never known. All of those statements, parts of the statements are true. Gregory, you will have gathered, is perhaps preeminently a theologian of antinomy, of paradox, apparent contradiction. He writes, "It is an attribute of all theology which wishes to respect piety to affirm now one thing, now another, when both affirmations are true." In trying to present Gregory's thoughts, I'm haunted by the idea that I've distorted the complexity by trying to give just kind of one idea, the idea of the body of light, the idea of deification, without at the same time affirming the opposite. But I had to do this, I think, just for clarity, for my own clarity, and for the clarity of what I'm trying to explain, so it may, at least to a certain extent, so that I may, to a certain extent, be able to communicate it. Clarity, it has to be said, I think this is true, clarity is not Gregory Palamas's aim. He's not aiming to give an argument with this, and this, and he's persuaded you at the end of it. What he's trying to do, Vladimir Lossky has written this. Vladimir Lossky writes, "The goal of this antinomic theology of apparent contradiction, is not to form a system of concepts, but to serve as a support for the human spirit in the contemplation of divine mysteries." And these antinomies, these apparent contradictions, Lossky goes on to say, are necessary to avoid replacing living experience with concepts. So antinomies, these apparent contradictions, are both a sign of real spiritual experience in Gregory Palamas, and may just about foster theologia in the reader. Furthermore, antinomies disrupt rationalism, safeguard the freedom of the individual experience. In the words of Andrew Louth, who's another British Eastern Orthodox theologian. In the words of Andrew Louth, who's discussing the theology of Pavel Florensky, without antinomies, without contradiction, we would simply be faced with rationally convincing proofs. This would mean that we would be compelled to accept. Truth without antinomy, says Love, is both tyrannical and also something which makes no sense in the world in which we live. End of quotation. Only, and then I continue, only paradox makes sense and doesn't at the same time. Why it wouldn't be paradox. The ruling antinomy in Gregory's discussion of deification and the body of light is an antinomy which I don't think is found in Western theology, the theology of the Western Church. It's the antinomy between the essence of God and the energies of God. It's a traditional antinomy in Orthodoxy. It runs through many of its teachings. Callistus Ware sums up this antinomy like this. In his essence, God is infinitely transcendent, radically unknowable, utterly beyond all created being, beyond all understanding and all participation from the human side. But in his energies, God is inexhaustibly immanent, core of everything, the heart of its heart, closer to the heart of each thing than that thing's own heart. These divine energies, Callistus Ware goes on, these divine energies, according to Gregory Palamas, are God himself in action, and each uncreated energy is God in his indivisible totality, not a part of him, but the whole. This idea that there's an absolutely unapproachable and unknowable essence, which is wholly God, and that there are energies which are it's basically God's working in the world, and these two are wholly God. They're not an emanation from God, they're not something separate from God, they're also wholly God. This strange idea of essence and energies is another one of those paradoxes which is not there to kind of convince. It's there to try, first of all, to give voice to an experience and to foster the experience further in the listeners or the readers of the theologian. Light, deifying light, is the manifestation of these energies which are wholly God, manifest as light. So when the body is transformed into light, it becomes the energy of God, it becomes wholly God, but not God at the same time, not the essence of God. The deified bodies of theologians, along with the whole wide transfigured worlds that they perceive and everything in it, are divine, and at the same time point the way to the divine which is forever elsewhere and not at the same time. Theologians participate in God through participation in the world, and at the same time eternally know that the essence of God is forever beyond that in the world. Thus, transformation leads to transformation, and each summit of longing inducing the next summit of longing, as longing increases without end, and the relatively infinite body becomes infinitely more relatively infinite. The source of all is seen and not seen, with ever greater clarity and unclarity. The divine source of, for the Orthodox theologian, God is never static, always dynamic, because the loving and light-filled relationship with him is dynamic, ever-changing, never-ending, and so necessarily are our deified selves. This experience of deification, should we ever experience it, will go on infinitely and continues eternally after death, in a process known in orthodoxy as epectasis. Epectasis, translated in many ways, but it basically means endless progress and development, endless drawing on, endless progress and development. And the final quotation today, it's another Gregory, this one is Gregory of Nyssa, describing epectasis, this endless dynamic movement. At each instant, writes Gregory of Nyssa, what is grasped is much greater than what had been grasped before. But, seeing what we are seeing that what we are seeking, I start at it again. I'm sorry, Gregory. At each instant, what is grasped is much greater than what had been grasped before. But, since what we are seeking is unlimited, the end of each discovery becomes the starting point for the discovery of something higher, and the ascent continues. Thus, continues Gregory, thus our ascent is unending. We go from beginning to beginning by way of beginnings without end. And he continues, nor, whilst ascending, do we cease to desire more, knowing what we know. Rather, as we rise by a greater desire to one still higher, we continue on our way into the infinite by increasingly higher ascents. Last sentence from me. The bright, shining body shows that we have become gods and that we have not yet even begun. And now my weak flesh is pretty weary, but if anyone wishes to comment or ask any questions, who knows what may emit from it.
I'd like to ask you a more or less personal question.
Yes.
That's fine. I was very moved by the story of Saint Seraphim. And because I'm very moved by this idea of taking the shape of God, that's why I'm so interested in Neanderthals and Crocodiles and those people. And then later on, you were talking about not giving too much attention to the material.
As the material.
Yes.
Yes.
And actually, my question is the opposite, which is in a religion, being part of a tradition that has masters like Saint Seraphim, how do you manage to get back into the material world? You know, how do you manage to go to work or to cook your dinners? Because the deep level of yearning that I felt as a non-Orthodox Christian for the story of Saint Seraphim was so strong that I can imagine that you could just get lost into that feeling.
I think I know what you mean. But if I think about the stories of other great saints of all kinds of traditions I'm talking about now, they always tend to be extremely practical people. So they're very good at practical things, and they pay attention to the world. They just perhaps see something else at the same time as they see the same, more or less the same world that we see. So I don't know. One answer to you is I don't know, because I have never experienced this myself. But I suspect that they manage to cultivate that double vision, see with two eyes, the way that Callistus Ware talks about it. He's drawing on Blake. They manage to live with the contemplation of God in everything, and they manage to see all the specific elements of that everything at the same time. I think another part of the answer would be that they are working within a tradition, that they've had teachers, and they've had teachers, other starets, other elders, or whatever, who will have warned them against dangers, warned them against hubris, warned them against falling in love with the light and not seeing what the light, at the same time, what the light is shining through. So I think that way lies wisdom, that way of seeing God and not seeing God, and seeing the world and not seeing the world, and being in the presence of God and knowing that I've got to do my washing up, like George King. I don't know. Is that an answer?
Yes,
that
I think
that they're held by a tradition. Because I can
That
see
makes
that
sense.
it's always a temptation.
Yes.
How could it not be?
Yes,
To just say.
Exactly.
but they tend to most of the people that I was talking about, what I was mentioning, are I think probably monastics. So they're working in a particular place, but they're also working. There's lots of work to do for monks and nuns.
Yes, you need to keep busy lest the demons get your attention.
Well,
I've read this I think in an Orthodox text actually.
yes, you need, or you need to be able to keep busy so that you've got something in your hand to throw at the demons.
Yes.
Sorry, I think Angela. Then
It's interesting that you showed that slide of Corban taken to Hill.
Yes.
And I was thinking all the time, what happened to the shadow? What happened to the shadow? This immense working towards the light.
yes.
So I'm interested in how then the devil or the shadow is burdened, because what happens when there's so much attention given to light? What happens to the darkness? And what happens to the... Because we were talking today about, enlightenment through darkness, through going down through the incubation rituals of going under the ground and the underworld, and that. I was thinking, this is the polar opposite. So what happens to the darkness then? Does it become, and what is the view of the devil, in other words? Does it become an antagonist?
Well, I guess I hope that this answer doesn't sound too abstract. I fear I may start sounding very abstract. I don't know. I guess that world of opposites of light and dark, God and the devil, or whatever, or matter and spirit. This is for, I would say, I'm going to say for people in the Orthodox tradition. At the same time, I'm kind of haunted by the idea that I may not actually be telling the truth, and it's very difficult to talk about everyone in the tradition. I don't know, but for people in the Orthodox tradition, I would say that those oppositions, the light and the shadow, they're products of the fall. When the shadow appears as a turning away from the light. It's an absence of the light, and it continues, I guess. I mean, it's the world that I inhabit, and most people too. I think as one gets closer to this light. The light and the shadow. The light illuminates the shadow, and the shadow gives form to the light. So the light doesn't just blast away the shadow. So it's not there. It's no longer there.
Simon, in Kabbalah, it's called you've got force and form.
Oh, yeah.
So it's polarity that you're talking about, really.
Polarity, right. When the light shines, it doesn't just shine as an amorphous light. It has a shape. It's given shape. There's something that there must be a kind of refractive darkness, I suppose, to give it that shape. Otherwise it would just be blinding light. So in the vision of Christ, it's not just that amazing light behind him, it's the figure which is more important. It's the figure which is important. And I would say that the shadow continues as a knowledge that the light, that I will never know the light, that I will only ever see the divine, or I see the divine and I don't see the divine at the same time. I just see shadow, but I don't get lost in the shadow. I don't turn away, and I think Peter wants to say something.
I just point out in the icon, in the centre of the icon, there are caves. There are pits of darkness, which is the same as in the nativity icon,
yes,
where Christ is born into his own tomb. Christ is born into a cave, and the manger is like a tomb in the Orthodox icon of the nativity. And also at the time when Christ is born into the world, doubt is also born into the world, because in the nativity icon in the Orthodox tradition there is an image of Joseph sitting thinking, well, what's going on here in the corner? And it's an old man whispering in his ear.
It's a kind of shaggy devil.
Yeah.
Yeah, don't believe it. You don't know what your wife's been up to. At the risk of just sidestepping also the question of what happens to the shadow, I would like to draw on Peter. How would you answer that question? What happens to the shadow side in the presence of that great overwhelming light? That was your question, wasn't it? Was it your question?
I suppose so. I suppose I'm just pondering on the fact that there are dark places of wisdom and light places of wisdom. And I'm wondering, does this eliminate the dark places of wisdom when one is so focused on the light?
Well, the dark places and the light places are the same place.
Yeah,
in
it's
the
the
end.
central character.
Many years ago, I wrote an article called "The Religion of Black and White," where I was using the play on words of religion being a reconnecting, so reconnecting black and white. And I talked about some of these questions about black and white, and I explained how etymologically the word black and the word white seem to be very similar. The word black, taken right back to its earliest meanings, it means black, absence of light, and at the same time it seems to mean shining, something which shines. So it's somehow, in the end, you get to a place which shines and is dark at the same time. And the white light can symbolise, because we're talking symbols, aren't we? Can symbolise the presence of God, in the sense that white is all of the colours together, isn't it? So it's everything. It's the presence of everything held in potential. When you look at it, you see, or hope to see, everything that is held in potential in that light. But black is also at the same time a symbol of of God. It's a symbol of that, of the negative theology. It's it shows that something can never be wholly known at the same time. And so in the vision of God of these mystics, there's a kind of eternally flickering black and white, in which white is black and black is white, and they're both at the same time.
Do you mind
So-
if I just
Oh, please do.
Just something, just exactly what you're saying. There's a 14th century Italian religious painter's manual, and it asks a rhetorical question: how do you know when your background or your halo is finished, is ready, is good enough? And there's a one-line answer, which is when it's black from its own brightness.
That's beautiful. That's really beautiful.
I'm just trying to find how to articulate this because there's so much going on here. A couple of things. First of all, is there a prescribed practice? Because you were talking about, I kind of lost track of the different, obviously prayer is key.
Prayer
Also-
and bodily posture, breathing.
Okay, so would there have been a prescribed... I can't help but think of yoga. I know it's not Eastern, but as a yoga practitioner myself, this idea of you have to replenish and remind and redo. You don't ever stop because it's what keeps you alive. It's the breath of life. And it's not the same, but it is the same. It's a very similar approach, I think. So that it isn't static. You're always reminding yourself, and you're always in and of it. So I didn't mean to say all of that, but. So what struck me was, A, is there a practice, and B, does it need to be witnessed by others? I mean, how do you know that your eyes, your heart can see? Is it something where you have a sudden moment of literally illumination, or is it need to be witnessed by others and born testament, if you like, that's been achieved? I don't know if that makes any sense, because it sounds to me like there's a practice here, and I'm just curious to know how it's...
There is a practice, but it's not a kind of set practice.
Okay.
From elder to elder, or monastery to monastery, or country to country, it may involve different things. It may be only the prayer, or it may be the prayer and posture, or it may be the prayer and certain breathing practices, or it may be all those three. It may combine other things. So it depends where you are and who's teaching you. I think that's one characteristic, I'd say, of the whole of orthodoxy, that it doesn't coalesce. There's not a catechism which says you do this, and you do this. It depends which tradition and the relationship with the person teaching you, and what they tell you to go away and do. And secondly, I think witness. I think it has to be, always has to be in a tradition, in the sense that it has to be. You have to be taught, and I mean that not just because you may turn into some terrible fire-breathing heretic, but because it can actually be dangerous. Using breathing techniques and internalized prayer and things like that. These are dangerous things. One needs real guidance from someone who really knows what they're talking about. And this person, I'm guessing, would be able to witness what's going on, and would be able to say, be careful here. Or don't get caught up in all of that, because that's behind all this too. Don't get caught up in the light. Don't get caught up in super sensors. They're not the point. I've been talking about them today, and it's practically all that I've been talking about. But the companion piece would be to say, would be another piece to say, well, then they're not at all the point, and the only point is love. But that would be a different talk.
Well, thank you.
Sam, because now we're talking about the practice and not so much the theology, and I think the main difference between what you tried to point out at the beginning of your lecture, the difference between the Western and the Eastern churches, that actually in the Eastern churches you have this practice, and it has been going on.
Well, yes.
And it goes back actually to the beginning of Christianity, and
Very
perhaps
early, anyway.
beyond that into the pagan world. But you said you didn't want to go into that at this point.
Well, no, I
Which is
just didn't
fine.
want to go into
Which
the
is fine.
mainstream ideas.
That's fine.
You know, it's not
Anyway,
my
and it
particular
continues up
experience.
to this day, and I think that is the most important difference because in the West that practice has disappeared. Even if we have in theology there's negative theology in the West as well, and there's lots of the ideas which you presented as being essentially Eastern Orthodox. They have some strand in Western Christianity, however, never a practice anymore. And this practice is so terribly interesting. And the prayer of the heart as something that directly connects the individual to God is very much a bridge towards the Eastern way of the approach, and has connections to Eastern mysticism, Buddhism, and so on. I think that in other fields where you talk about the Grail and so on, you have made this connection as well. I spotted an article where you made that connection when I was writing something on John Towner. I think that although we have been talking about theology, the essential message of your talk tonight was they have a practice.
Well, I was talking about theology in the sense that in the higher sense, which is it's an experience, an attempt to talk about, and not always failed attempts, but anyway, an attempt to talk about an experience, and that experience comes from a practice. It's practical. Theology is practical, is practice in Eastern Orthodox Church.
I do think that it's doing a disservice to Catholicism to say that
Go
do not
on.
have a practice, because Catholicism, not as much as Orthodoxy, but we still have monasteries and we still have orders that just live for prayer. And I think, like for instance, the communal or the individual prayer of the Rosary, it's very similar to this kind of practice. And if it has lost a little bit of the transcendental power of it, it has lost a lot of the transcendental power of it. But praying a Rosary, I mean, you're doing this repetitive prayer that you internalize. It's very similar.
Every old lady does it. In France or in Portugal, in Spain, every old lady is doing this very corporeal thing of going through the beads and praying.
Yeah, there's stations of the cross.
And you do the novenas, which is you do this for 9 whole weeks. So that's a lot of repetitive praying, and yeah.
I think of Ignatian exercises too, for strong visualizations. They're very different because they rely on visualization and the kind of practices that I was talking about. Stripping away, as it were, the visual to then paradoxically see what's really there anyway. But those exercises, the exercises of Ignatius of Loyola, are very interesting. The use of the imagination to put oneself to live the life of Christ. Moira.
You've cited some fantastic examples of individual experience and testimonies of those, and I think it was the Saint Seraphim with the discussion with the man who wouldn't look at him.
Yes, that's right.
And I wondered if you'd come across any references to prosophic union between people.
To what you?
Prosophic. Well, I'm not entirely sure what a prosophic is. You don't know, do you?
It's face-to-face contemplation where it's sort of face-to-face meditation where masks drop away.
I think prosophic is an emanation.
Oh, it means mask, doesn't
Yeah,
it?
it's
It's a kind of. It's another word for a kind of person.
Yeah, but
Yes.
I think there is discussion of it in the Orthodox tradition. A union between people, embodied people.
Yes.
And I just wondered whether because you seem to have read so widely around it, whether you'd actually come across that.
I haven't come across the term, hence my confusion at that moment. but in a way, it's what all Orthodox, and I guess all religion, I don't know, it's about. It's the looking at something with the eyes of love, and when one looks at someone, I have to say, with the eyes of love, it's another person, Christ, whatever, Buddha, then you're drawn on. You're drawn constantly on, in that process of epectasis that I was talking about. So you knowing that you know the person, and knowing that you will never finish, and that you will never know the person, and seeing the real face of the person, and knowing that the face that you're seeing will never be the real face of the person, because you'll never really know them. And that's another way of talking about it. That, I don't know if that's what this, what do you call it? Prosopic union means. I don't know. It seems like another word for love to me.
It's very similar to the idea of platonic eros as well.
It's a very precise thing in the sense of the communion. You know, it's a sacred thing, and it sounded like that was what was happening between the one who consented. So I'm not sure, but I haven't read that passage about that discussion.
I guess in order to answer your question, I'd have to know something about Prosopic.
Just asking if you'd come across it.
I haven't, I'm afraid, no. Sorry, Jeffrey wanted to...
Well, yes, no, I'm glad we had the defence of Western Catholicism in a sense, because one could see from the Catholic mystical tradition, almost a very similar explication as you've given from the Orthodox tradition. So, just as one couldn't compare the Catechism with, say, monastic teachings and spirituality, sorry, I could see that. But here's a question that does concern me. It's whether you feel that the Orthodox tradition has any capacity better than what we know of Christianity in the West to reach across mystically to other mystical traditions, so that when can we ever get to the point where a Christian mystic can see that they are, as with a Buddhist mystic and as with an Islamic and Sufi mystic, that actually the paths are different paths to one goal? I mean, you know what I'm asking for, whether there's any capacity in Eastern Orthodoxy to take this step, because I think our current age really demands of spiritual practices, or is that too much to ask?
I don't think so. I mean, I would hope, and it would be my intuition that any, I wouldn't even say mystic, but anyone deeply involved in, perhaps I will go back to the word mystical, and anyone deeply involved in a mystical practice, no matter what the origin of that practice, will be able to recognise something in people from other traditions, will be able to recognise that there is a rightness and a properness and legitimacy to them. I'd say that I'm not sure, to tell you the truth, whether I would say that they all have the same end, because of this. I don't know about other traditions. I'm just thinking now about this Orthodox idea of endless movement and endless change, which never stops. There's no stop to it. So there's not a summit. You just go from summit to summit to summit to summit to summit to summit, and that's real infinity and real eternity, I suppose, in the Orthodox tradition. So what I think I'm saying is that I think, and I don't think, possibly I'm not the only person who thinks this, I don't know, that the tradition that one embraces, it not only forms one's practice and the aim of one's practice and the vision of one's practice and what one deeply in one's being knows and understands. But also, and this sounds strange, it also continues after death, so that what one experiences after death is the result of one's own practice. And I think, why should it not be? Because I don't, here I'm talking, I suppose, as a Christian, because I start talking about God, and I start talking about God being infinite, and I know that other traditions would not see it that way. But if God is infinite, then also after death there's an infinite number of ways of experiencing and understanding and being in communion, or otherwise, with God, if it is so that He's infinite. As another answer to your question is a very interesting book. Can't exactly remember the title. It's edited by James Cutzinger, or Cutzinger, I'm not sure how he pronounces his name, which brings together people, kind of Islamic mystics and Orthodox mystics, to all talk about the heart and the role of the heart, because it's very similar in many ways. They, both say Sufi mystics and Orthodox mystics talk about the eye or eyes of the heart and opening the eyes of the heart, and maybe by concentrating on particular the central symbols in various traditions, there's a way of engaging in dialogue which isn't one against the other or making a point or trying to prove something, but is a real dialogue about a central symbol, informed by that central symbol and the experience of that symbol. I don't know. That's a part of it.
Yes.
I don't know. Yeah. Sorry, James.
Simon, within the tradition, this kind of radiation of light,
yes,
divine light, is not necessarily the aim. Is it more?
It's not the aim.
Is it a consequence? A consequence of your relationship with the divine? Is this all emanating light?
It's a manifestation of that relationship. Yes, it's not something you aim for.
No.
I mean, I realise that that could be implied, or appears to be implied by my talk, because I really was concentrating on bodies and the body of light, etc. As if the aim of mysticism was to become a body of light. It's not. The aim of mysticism is to essentially live a life of love, I guess.
But a potential consequence,
yes,
could be
in this case
emanating light.
Yes. I would like to give one more person, if that's okay. And time has really gone on, but Chris, you wanted to.
Well, it was really just a follow up on Jeffrey's question.
Oh yes.
I thought that probably it was kind of implicit in that antinomic way of thinking that you were talking about.
That's a good point.
Well, on the one hand, yes, they're different traditions, but on the other hand, they're not different traditions. So that very mindset.
There are elements in all traditions, I think, and even in the Christian traditions, there are elements and points that you can find which are actually central, so they're in the Bible or whatever, which show awareness of other traditions and kind of allow them. So yeah, you're right. If deification leads to an awareness or a contemplation and a direct seeing of God and a knowledge that one will never ever see God ever, that perhaps opens up a space. You're right.
The very assumption behind the idea itself is.
I think we have to come to